So how exactly humans will participate in this process is a perhaps greater challenge than whether AI will be well, let me be careful, not necessarily AI, but whatever computerized processes will handle it. That's a bigger question. Humans are the most powerful and the weakest links in the decision-making process.
From the Defense and Aerospace Report, this is The Downlink, a podcast about the intersection of space, the space business, and defense. Not just what's over the horizon, but what's happening above it. I'm your host, Laura Winter. This week, President Donald Trump has declared in an executive order that NASA has as a primary function intelligence, counterintelligence, investigative, or national security work. It's believed that Trump's executive order, which was issued just before Labor Day, that is really intended to strip NASA employees of their labor union representation. Agencies that are classified as having a primary national security function cannot be represented by unions. I am not a lawyer, but if you read the 1958 legislation that created NASA, you may find that the executive order contradicts the text of the National Aeronautics and Space Act. NASA's creation was a response to the Soviet Union's Sputnik launch in October 1957. The Sputnik program was deeply intertwined with the Soviet military and thus represented the not-so-free world. So establishing NASA as a civilian agency and barring it from developing weapons was very much intentional to demonstrate that this agency's focus would be on technology development and exploration, that the purpose was peaceful. So now that could be a wee bit in doubt. We also have another big piece of news. President Trump signed an executive order relocating Space Command from the state of Colorado to the state of Alabama. It's been argued that Trump's decision to relocate Space Command is political retribution rather than a practical determination. Colorado has voted for a presidential candidate other than Trump twice. On Tuesday, Trump said that a, quote, big factor, unquote, influencing his decision was that Colorado allows by-mail voting. Now, with the big news out of the way, in this week's episode, we're taking a look at artificial intelligence and space systems, specifically what role AI technology will need to play in the space-based part of Golden Dome, or next-generation missile defense. And for this concept to work, decisions may need to be made in 150 seconds or less to destroy an incoming ICBM. That very short decision window makes humans the weakest link. To talk about this, we have a very special guest from the land domain, Alexander Kott. He was the chief scientist for the U.S. Army's Research Laboratory and has been involved with developing AI for complicated systems since the 1980s. In 2003, he was part of an experiment at the U.S. Army Battle Command Battle Laboratory Leavenworth that employed AI in brigade-level decision-making. So he knows a thing or two about using AI and battle management. And in retirement, he's now working with defense technology startups. But before we get to our conversation, I want to remind you one last time that on Monday, September 8th, starting at 9 a.m. Mountain Time, the Value of Space Summit will open, and it's being kicked off with a special live streaming event called Stacks Talk. You can get the details at stackstalk.io. That is staxtalk.io. Or you can find Stacks Talk on LinkedIn and on YouTube. We're going to be talking about space, cutting-edge technology, and national security before a standing room-only audience. It's really exciting, and I'm very proud of the Stacks Talk team, and I really hope you will be able to spend some time with us, either in person or online. The live stream will be on YouTube. So now, here's our conversation with Alex. Hello, Alex. Welcome to the Downlink podcast.
Thank you, Laura. I am tremendously glad to be here.
Alex, you are one of those people who have a CV longer than my leg, but we can get into everything just a little bit later. So, if you could, please take a moment and tell us just the wave tops. Tell us who you are and what you do now. Alex?
Laura, the shortest version is about 2 years ago, I retired as the chief scientist of the United States Army Research Laboratory. I was at the time I was in the rank of ST, which is like an SAS only in technology. And for the last 2 years, I have been doing all the fun things that retired people do or should do. And I also advise a fairly large number of startups and small innovative companies, primarily in the defense space, in defense technology space kind of companies. That's what I do.
That's fantastic. Now, I really want you to give my space minded audience the why, why I've got a guy from the land domain on a space podcast, right? But it's really your deep background in AI and control and command systems. And you really started thinking about this in the 1980s when you were working at Elliott Company in Jeanette, Pennsylvania, and pursuing your doctorate in mechanical engineering from the University of Pittsburgh. Could you briefly tell the audience what your research was about?
Yes, Laura. Back in the very early 1980s, I was a very young engineer, and I discovered that a lot of things that I do and my colleagues do day after day, relatively mundane engineering work, can be actually computerized and automated. And I further learned about artificial intelligence, and I came to the conclusion, you may say I had an epiphany, that a lot of this intellectual work will be possible to do with artificial intelligence. It will be like steam power, just like a steam shovel replaced thousands of people with manual shovels. It will be a tremendous change and tremendous advancement to the technology in general and society in general. And when I started to work with military, first at one of the first AI companies in the world called Carnegie Group, and then at DARPA as a DARPA program manager, I was actively trying to prove that it's possible to apply AI to military problems, particularly to decision making in the military domain. And in that sense, it's almost like an introduction of gunpowder in the warfare, tremendously changing everything about warfare and creating a revolution in it. That was my thinking at the time.
Well, let's just dive into that bit about what you've been doing with the military and when that all kind of really kicked off. Because you were with the Carnegie Group before you were on the inside, before you were with DARPA, and you were working in the AI community well before it was cool in the 2000 aughts at the US Army's Battle Command Battle Laboratory at Leavenworth. And you were involved in an experiment that examined using machine learning to speed up decision making on the battlefield. And there's been more ever since. And your co authors, Anantram Swamy and Bruce West, were credited with creating the term the Internet Battle of Things. And I've seen slides that illustrate connectedness, communication linkages that you have presented between wearable devices, robots, munitions, and human decision makers. I know you haven't dropped it in retirement. So, what's driving the passion for you to keep doing this now?
I believe, Laura, that there is a growing need and a growing opportunity for introduction of AI, particularly the modern advances in AI, into military decision making. And there are two major areas where AI applies in the decision making on the battlefield. One is in providing the brains of the artificial warriors, the drones, for example, or the ground robots, so that they could decide on their own how to move, for example, where to aim, not necessarily who or what to shoot at, but at least how to position themselves and make other important decisions about their activities. So that's one big area, brains for the artificial warriors. And we see amazing progress of that being made, particularly on the battlefields of the Russo-Ukraine war that unfortunately continues right now. The second huge area is the application of AI in decision making, in command and control, in battle command, mission command, whatever terminology you want to use. And I've been working on this literally since early 1990s. One of the experiments that you mentioned was building one of the first, perhaps the first, prototype, fairly substantial and capable prototype of planning ground military operations and performing elements of what is known as a military decision-making process. I worked at the time, as you mentioned, in collaboration with the Battle Lab in Fort Leavenworth, Battle Command Battle Lab in Fort Leavenworth. Interestingly enough, my co-worker at the time was a gentleman by the name Robert Rush. At the time, he was a captain. Now he is a lieutenant general. So these are the two huge areas that are both ripe and feasible for implementation in battle command and military in general. That's what drives me.
So, you know how hard it is to get from that experimental stage where you're proving out what your concepts are, your thesis, your hypothesis, and all that. But how hard is it to incorporate these kinds of ideas such as AI into military systems? Because we know that things are really systems of systems here, and the military is a special kind of system of systems. And knowing that your background is very much in the ground domain with the Army, there's a lot of moving parts. In space, well, it also has a lot of moving parts. So I think there's some lessons to be learned here. So, how hard is it to incorporate AI into military systems?
So first of all, let's talk about the one most important value or some very important capability of AI tools, at least some AI tools. And that is solving problems with many moving parts, just like you mentioned about military operations that typically have many moving parts, and they all are connected in some ways or should be connected in some ways. If they don't work well, if they're not connected. And the challenge is to find a course of action, for example, a plan of actions that would work against a capable enemy while engaging all the assets or all the appropriate assets that the friendly forces might have, and assigning to them tasks at the right time, at the right place, in proper coordination with other assets. In case of missile defense that you are interested in, Laura, I know in particular, that would be making sure that various sensors, of which there are many different types of different nature, various sources of information, various interceptors, logistic systems, the battle damage assessment systems, all those systems should work together and inform each other. And when some of them fail, inevitably, or when the enemy makes them fail, you rapidly reconfigure all that complicated, highly orchestrated set of activities in a way that will continue the fight effectively.
And that all has to happen on a very short timeline. And so, yeah, let's get into the space domain, right? We have the Trump administration. It has the Golden Dome project, which is new, and it will have a huge emphasis on building out a space based defense layer, a system of systems that should have resilient communications, resilient sensors, resilient space based munitions. And those munitions are called space based interceptors. And the challenge, the goal is to make it possible to incapacitate or destroy adversary missiles shot, from the ground through space. And the idea, of course, for the adversary is to have that missile come back to the ground. But there is a time, there is a period when those missiles are extremely vulnerable, and that's called the boost phase. And just to clarify, the boost phase is the period of time after the missile rocket is lit to when that rocket engine turns off. It's much easier to see and therefore target something that has a fire that is hot. And that period of time is roughly 150 seconds. So I got to wonder, and I'm pretty sure many in the audience do too, what should be AI's job, or perhaps more accurately, jobs? What should those jobs be? What does it need to do for the humans in the loop that the humans just simply can't get done on such short timelines?
Yes, Laura, you touched on a whole bunch of very important questions that would take us quite a few podcasts to answer. Uh, so let's start with the detection of the boost during the boost phase. Obviously, we need a variety of sensors for that, and these sensors may be space based, but they also may be ground based. In fact, they could be extremely close to the launch system, as the activities of Israel against Iranian air defenses and other systems have demonstrated. There can be very close, literally within a few kilometers, certain sensors. I just mentioning this to emphasize that the gamut of various types of sensors and more generally information sources, including human, for example, can be tremendously broad. We shouldn't be limiting ourselves just to the notion of space-based sensors. And all these sensors have different capabilities. They provide different types of data, and they need to be fused. They need to be combined. There's different levels of sensor fusion. There is a entity level fusion. There is activity level fusion. There is predictive analysis. In other words, figuring out what does it mean, where they're going to fly, trying to understand whether or not these are decoys or real launches, and so on and so on. And this sensor fusion, this situation awareness formulation, is a huge part of what AI can do. The second huge role of AI is what I already started to talk about, and that is formulating the plan of actions. What to do, who should do it, what kind of hundreds and thousands of activities need to be performed within on a very short time scale, measured in seconds or minutes. The third one that I didn't mention is the role of continuously updating and continuously revising these plans of actions as the situation continuously change. The situation continuously changed. Some interceptors fail to intercept. Some of the friendly systems are being destroyed by the enemy systems. Some of the enemy systems are being destroyed by means other than interceptors, perhaps. The new information comes in constantly. All this needs to be taken into account, and the intricate fabric of all these decisions and actions need to be constantly, within seconds or even fractions of seconds, reevaluated and redesigned, rebuilt. And on top of that, of course, the human element is incredibly important. You mentioned human in the loop, which is a scary proposition when you're talking about time scales of seconds, or perhaps human on the loop, and that we can discuss for hours separately, Laura.
Indeed, we could. But let me just ask you another question, because you've just mentioned so many things, which is actually the point, right? There are so many things that have to be organized, that have to be synchronized, that have to be connected and fused and made into something that's actually usable for that human, maybe not in the loop, but human on the loop, right? And to illustrate what I'm talking about, I mean, Defense One reported that a person who was attending the Missile Defense Agency's Industry Day, which happened, a few days back, right? That person mentioned that there's a quantity challenge and then there's a time challenge, and that you want to be able to hit missiles as quickly as you can. And AI can sort through that, much, much faster than a human can. But that the scale could be huge, not just a dozen, which would possibly overwhelm what we already have in place, but 100 or 200. And that's just, looking at missile attacks. I mean, I'd assume that there would also be cyber attacks at the same time, right? And so you have to wonder aloud here, isn't there a risk of being overwhelmed? And can AI really handle that? Is the state of the technology ready for that?
Laura, these are great questions. I Personally, I believe that the scale is something that can be handled. We're still talking about what we have seen in the conflict between Israel and Iran recently. We're talking about perhaps hundreds of various types of missiles and drones launched within a relatively short period of time. If we have to deal with a much more capable country than Iran, which is, after all, a relatively modest military power, if we have to deal with a true military peer of ours, we may be talking about many thousands of individual entities that have to be considered at any given moment, individual missiles, drones, cruise missiles, and so on and so on. I believe this is a scale that is manageable. We know that major defense contractors, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, they have developed systems for ballistic missile defense. They are being upgraded and further developed. I am sure they have considered issues of scale, and so that should be manageable. What is much less manageable is what do humans do in this process? How well do they handle this scale? I mentioned already that I am dubious about any human in the loop schemes, because it is anticipated that in the concept of human in the loop, that human will continuously review the products of AI or whatever computer system is managing the process of planning and executing the missile defense processes, and we'll find errors there, perhaps, and we'll correct those errors, and we'll then give permission to execute. At the scale of dozens, it's difficult, extremely difficult. At scale of hundreds, it's impossible, in my opinion. So how exactly humans will participate in this process is a perhaps greater challenge than whether AI will be well, let me be careful, not necessarily AI, but whatever computerized processes will handle it. That's a bigger question. Humans are the most powerful and the weakest links in the decision-making process.
So, Alex, maybe we should just take a quick second and actually explain the difference between a human in the loop and a human on the loop. What is that difference?
So human in the loop and human on the loop are two most commonly considered concepts of how human beings, human decision makers, participate in a process, in a decision process, an execution process that may be performed by a computer system. Human in the loop means that the computer produces some sort of a recommendation, The human reviews that recommendation, thinks about that recommendation, perhaps detects some weaknesses or outright errors in that recommendation, corrects them, modifies the recommendation, or maybe completely rewrites that recommendation, and finally pushes the button go and execute. Human uses computer primarily as a support tool, as a decision support tool. That's
That
human in the loop.
and that takes human time, right?
That human
That's
takes
not
human time.
that's not just a second or two. And I mean, I'm a writer and I can tell you that I take time to write, and my editors will tell you that I take time to write. So therefore that is human time. But if it's human on the loop, then that would be more on AI time or computer time. And how would
That's
that
correct,
work?
Laura. Yes, Laura, you're absolutely correct. That is much closer to the computer time. And that is a situation where human does not get directly inserted into the chain of decision making and execution. Instead, the human gives a initial guidance, kind of policy and overall objectives to the system that it will take into account, constraints and restraints that system should take into account, and it will continuously observe the behavior of the system as it makes the decisions and executes those decisions. If something doesn't look right, the human on the loop can intervene at the high level, by which I mean by changing the guidance, by modifying the constraints that the system should observe, perhaps switching from a misbehaving system to a different system. In other words, it doesn't directly slow down the process, but guides the process on the loop. Is that reasonably clear?
It is. Thank you so much. And, when we first spoke about doing this episode, you mentioned that a lot of folks in defense were running through, let's call it the garden of machine learning and AI and stepping on rakes, right? Which certainly brings up memories of watching Looney Tunes. So that when you run and you step on a rake, the rake comes up and it bonks you in the head and leaves basically an egg in your forehead. So I want to know, what did you mean by that? And how should we avoid the rakes and the grass?
All right, there are quite a few of those rakes, but let me mention the most important one. Laura, the biggest rake that has to do with these complex systems is, of course, current desire to use AI in these systems. And that brings us to discussion of this endless cycle of disappointment, first excitement and disappointment, this endless extreme hype cycle that occurs with AI. AI, of course, is a long existing, fairly old discipline. The term itself was coined back in mid 50s, I believe. By that time, AI was already a well-studied field. And what we see again and again, this enormous hype cycles of extreme excitement and extreme hopes about AI, and then extreme disillusionment and abandonment of all that we have done in AI. This happens again and again, and I would say this is one of the most painful rakes on which we're constantly stepping. Laura, I remember in late 1980s, I was working for one of the first in the world AI company. And I remember writing proposals to very competent, large, highly successful corporations, which was basically a boilerplate about expert systems and semantic networks and logic programming. And then we would add a few words about the particular terminology that corporation uses for its products. And we would submit the proposal and they would just swallow it without any consideration. They were so excited about using AI. They wanted to report to their bosses that they're using AI. So any proposal was accepted. It was almost embarrassing. And then when I came to DARPA in 2003, one of the first things that I was told, because I was working on use of AI in command and control at the time, I was told not to use the word AI. It's verboten. It's prohibited. You cannot use that word. It is fraudulent. There's no such thing as AI. That's what I was told by my bosses at DARPA. This is the horrible cycle of again and again getting overexcited and then trying to forget what we've done about AI. And every generation, in fact, every decade, I think, we repeat the same mistake and stepping on the same rake.
Wow. We should really just basically stay the course then, is what you're saying.
Stay
Like
the course. Steady, steady, steady.
So just to wrap this up, if you had one piece of advice for developing AI for Golden Dome, what would that piece of advice be?
Let me give you very quickly 3 pieces of advice. First, be careful about assuming that AI is the right tool, especially tools that are not necessarily most suitable, such as large language model based technologies. There are many other AI tools. Consider them carefully, consider them objectively. Don't jump to a conclusion that I must use AI. Advice number 2, consider what the human will do and how he or she will do in that system and in that process. And finally, enemy. Remember the enemy. Enemy will always find a way to exploit your decision-making process, including AI-based decision-making process. That's 3.
Alex, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome, Laura. It was my pleasure.
That's it for this week. For your daily dose of award-winning defense coverage, listen to the Defense and Aerospace Report with Vago Muradian. And for the maritime domain, listen to Cavas Ships with Chris Cavas and Chris Cervello. And get your air domain news and analysis from the Air Power Podcast with JJ Gertler and Vago Muradian. I'm Laura Winter. Thank you for listening.